All right. Thanks for everyone for being here today. As you join in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and we are going to get started. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Teresa Sweetland. I'm the Executive Director of Forecast Public Art. And this is our second in our six-part series this year of Creative Power, Civic Purpose, How Artists Strengthen Democracy series. Today's topic is Knowledge is Power, Demystifying Civic Systems Through Creative Practice. We're going to have a great session today. Before anything else, I want to thank the Educational Foundation of America for supporting this series and helping make this learning space possible with all of you joining today. And your host for today, I'm Teresa. We're joined by Mallory as well. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Mallory Roxana Nazem is our curator of programs and partnerships for Forward and is based in Atlanta, Georgia. So we're hosting you today and for the entire series. We're happy you're here. Briefly, if you're not already familiar with Forecast, we are a 48-year-old Minnesota-based nonprofit working across the Midwest and nationally. Our mission is to activate, inspire, and advocate for public art that advances justice, health, and human dignity. And we strive towards that mission by funding artists who are working in public and civic practice, building partnerships with artists and public agencies, sharing tools and stories, and we bring people together in conversations and convenings like this one. And I want to give you a quick sense of how we're going to spend our time together. So we have 90 minutes together. We are going to do a little bit of grounding on the series. We are going to move into some data about the civic literacy crisis. Then we have a panel conversation with three incredible artists, and we're going to spend the majority of our time hearing from them and engaging with them as well. And then we're going to close out by connecting everyone to our national toolkit that we're building, and you'll get a preview of the next session. And all of today's session is going to be recorded. So if you can't join us for the entire time, we're going to share it out with you within the next week. So why are we doing this series? We created this series because we saw a real need for people working in the arts and people working in civic engagement and democracy to learn from each other and ultimately build collective power. So we're holding a series of questions. What does it look like when artists and arts groups are seen as critical civic actors and collaborators, helping communities imagine, build, defend, and sustain a healthier democracy? What becomes possible when the arts field and the democracy field work together? And too often these fields are working in parallel, but not in partnership. And so the series is really about bringing those worlds together. So we've curated a six-part series. We had our first one in February. Today is Knowledge is Power. Our event in May will be Lessons from Rural and Southern and Cultural Leadership. And then we're going to talk about trust, neighboring, and cultural work of democracy, the art of governance with artist and government collaborations. And then our last session in October, we're going to be talking about funding, and we'll be joined by some funders. So we'll be excited to hopefully hear about some real world opportunities supporting this work. In our first session, if you were here, we talked about civic health and the many roles that artists are already playing in strengthening the social fabric of our communities and defending it, as our artists from Minnesota showed us. And we did a poll during that first session, and we saw that all of you attended because you're very serious about the urgency you're facing in your own communities. And so today we're building on that. So we are going to talk today about civic knowledge and civic understanding. And the United States is facing what many researchers describe as a civic literacy crisis. We're living in a moment when there are coordinated efforts to restrict participation, limit access to voting, and deliberately undermine trust in public systems. So we're not just going to talk about a knowledge gap. We're going to talk about this as a power issue as well. We're going to hear from three incredible artists who are responding to that challenge creatively and concretely. But before we look at solutions, we need to understand the problem we're facing. So I'm going to hand it over to Mallory to really ground us in some of this data. Mallory.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you all for being here. Last session, our part one, we had a wonderful guest speaker, Richard Young of Civic Lex, and he led us through some information around this national civic health crisis. So this is pulled from our last presentation, and we're continuing that conversation today. So as Richard and many researchers say, we're in a national civic health crisis. What does that look like? Civic health requires different components of civic well-being to be present and strong in our society. Civic knowledge is a big part of that, and that's what we're going to focus on today, as well as civic action is important and civic associations. So this again was presented last session. We're weaving it back in, and Richard shared with us these really staggering statistics about our civic knowledge in the US. 24% of the young Americans can identify all three branches of government. So only about a quarter, which means majority of young Americans cannot identify those three branches. 13% of eighth graders are proficient or higher in US history, in the subject of US history, which means the majority of eighth graders are not. And then lastly, 19% of Americans cannot name a single First Amendment right. So that means about a quarter of Americans cannot name a single First Amendment right. So we are quite lacking in our individual knowledge about our civic systems. At the same time, we see data that shows that almost 3/4 of Americans are very confident about their civic knowledge. So specifically this test of confidence that you could explain how the government of the US works to somebody outside of the US. So while, we look back at our real statistics where we're quite low in our knowledge, we somehow believe that we actually understand it. So there's a bit of a mismatch here between our actual knowledge and our perceived knowledge. And then similarly, we have a legibility gap within our civic systems. A lot of people in various research practices find that it's just complicated. It's hard to figure out what to do when you need something done in your community or when you want to change something. Similarly, this results in many residents feeling like things are being done to them versus actually participating in the decisions that shape their lives. This is often identified as a legibility gap. And then similarly, there's a challenge with capacity. So civic participation really only works with the assumption that people actually know how to navigate systems. So you might know how, let's say you have that knowledge, but a lot of folks don't have the time, they don't have the capacity, or sometimes they don't have the information to actually engage in that system. And then similarly, we see something called structural friction, where just figuring out how to navigate these systems is a very common barrier. Figuring out who to call, what website to go to, what office to go to, how many signatures to get, who to call, those kinds of questions are very common for people. And then obviously there are compounding challenges for marginalized populations, which we'll talk about shortly, but we're going to pause here because I want to hear a little bit from you all. We're going to launch a poll about your own experience in engaging with these systems. So I'm going to have Jen help launch our first poll. So you should see this pop up on your screen. Just a note, if you don't, it's typically, we had to figure this out last time because your Zoom account might need to be updated. So apologies if you do not see the poll, but hopefully you do. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment and answering these 3 questions. I'm going to just share those questions for folks who maybe are not able to see the poll right now. The first question is, if you wanted to create a park in your neighborhood, would you know where to go? The second question is, if you wanted to change a policy in your city, town, or tribe, would you know how to get started? And then our last question is, if you needed to quickly organize your entire block, how long would that take? So I'll give you one more moment to fill out that poll. And then Jen, can you close the poll and share the results with us just so we can all see what it looks like? So hopefully you can see these poll results. So our first question, if you wanted to create a park in your neighborhood, would you know where to go? And we see that the majority of folks answered sort of. So you have some information, but not fully confident. Then about 39% said yes, which is quite high. Maybe this group is going to be a little more skewed towards knowing how to get these things done. And then a good 11% of us do not know how to do that, which is completely fair and quite common. Second question was, if you wanted to change a policy in your city, town, or tribe, would you know how to get started? And actually quite similar to the above question, we see similar percentages here. So about half of us are saying sort of, then the rest of us saying yes or not at all. And then lastly, this looks maybe a little bit different. Number 3 is if you needed to quickly organize your entire block, how long would it take? And most of us are saying it would take a little bit of time, but not a long process. That's quite impressive, about 50% of us. And then the rest of us are saying it would either take a while, I could do it immediately, and then a good almost 20% of us saying, I'm not sure it would ever happen. So I think maybe this group is, I think based on the percentages we saw earlier, our group is probably a little bit more aware of how to engage these systems, but yet, even for those of us who perhaps work in the civic engagement space, we still face our own challenges of really understanding how to make these systems work. Thank you, Jen. We can take the poll results down. Wonderful. So we've got the structural friction problem. And then we also have accessibility challenges, because we know that civic navigation isn't the same everywhere or across all communities. So civic navigation looks like, knowing where to go and how to utilize these systems. So we see some research from reporting systems, and that's pulled from things like 311 or reporting apps, for example, getting a pothole fixed. And this research shows us that in low income and marginalized communities, users are using these civic reporting platforms yet less. And some of the potential differences for that use may be digital access, internet access, or ability to utilize, digital tools, perhaps smartphone access, that kind of challenge. Familiarity with systems, a lot of times if there's a learning curve, or maybe you learn it from someone in your community or a parent, and if you don't have that connection, it can be a challenge. Just trusting government. There are a lot of different cultural barriers to having that kind of trust. And then similarly, cultural norms. Does my community interact with this system in this way? And might I have inherited, cultural norms that keep me safe, or that are just standardized ways that I am taught to interact with the system? So there are a lot of different ways that civic navigation is utilized differently by different communities. And then we come to the topic of civic deserts, which is, I think, quite an interesting phenomenon, which are places with few to no opportunities for people to meet, discuss issues, or address problems. So this looks like, feeling like if I wanted, again, with some of those questions that we had in the poll, if I wanted to make something happen in my community, would I know where to go to talk to people about it? Do I have a space, to talk about data centers? Would I know where to begin that, the kind of social component of civic organizing or civic discourse? And so data also shows us that this is very commonly reported amongst rural youth. So you have kind of, I think, two components here of rural communities and access to these kinds of civic spaces, and also young people feeling disengaged from those spaces. And then similarly, about 30% of urban and suburban Americans also feel that. So it's quite pervasive in a lot of different types of communities. And then in our next poll, we want to hear if you feel this civic desert presence in your own life. So we're going to launch that. So this question, if you cannot see the poll, says, in my community, we have spaces and or opportunities for people to meet, discuss issues, or address problems. And then it's kind of a scaled answer here. In my community, we have spaces and or opportunities for people to meet, discuss issues, or address problems. I'll give you a moment to answer that question. And then we can close that poll, Jen, and put our results up. So in my community, we have spaces and our opportunities for people to meet, discuss issues, or address problems. And the majority of us said we have some places to do that. The next runner-up is we have many. I'm happy to see that. And then about 20% or so are saying we have few and 4% saying not really. So happy to see in this group that there are a lot of spaces to meet and discuss. We can close that poll. Oh, and sorry, Lauren, here is the source of the data. I did not advance the slide enough. This is out of Tufts University. So just kind of summarizing some of the challenges that we see in this civic literacy space is a structural civic literacy gap, a navigation barrier. It's hard to figure it out. And then some ongoing baked in equity challenges that just make it harder for certain groups to access this system and to trust it. However, we know it's not all bad. I think what's really great to see is that there's also research that shows us this correlation between civic knowledge and civic participation. So when our civic knowledge goes up, often our civic participation also goes up. So this research shows that about 80% of people who score high on civic knowledge have plans to engage in at least one civic activity. So there is some correlation there. And that is partly why we're here today. And some of the stories that we want to hear from our presenters is what happens when we can up that civic knowledge and that civic participation together, and how can artists help to lead that. So that's all from me. And Teresa, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mallory. There's so much in what you shared, and we're happy to share some of this data and some of this information. I want to just reflect and reiterate a couple of things back that I feel like are really important in this moment. And what we're seeing in this crisis is not just a gap in legibility, or not just a gap in knowledge, but we're seeing three compounding gaps. Gap in legibility. This is, can people see how systems work and where they fit? Gap in capacity. So do people have the time, information, and support to engage? And a gap in access. So whose systems are designed for and who they leave out. And so, as we named earlier, we're really working with not just a technical problem, but a power issue of who has a voice. And I think what happens is what we're seeing now. Like when systems are confusing and opaque and difficult to navigate, participation doesn't just decrease, it becomes inequitable. When participation is exclusionary, the implications are bigger than who just shows up. It's who's recognized, whose voices are heard, and who holds power. And over time, it shapes the legitimacy of the system itself. And I think that's why this moment matters so much, because we're living through a time when the question of whose voice counts in our democracy is being actively contested. We're seeing efforts that make it harder for people to participate fully in civic life, restrictions on voting access, policies that silence immigrant communities, attacks on the rights and safety of transgender people, and ongoing structural barriers that disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So these are not abstract debates. They are most certainly civil rights issues. And so this is exactly where artists play a really powerful and often under-recognized role. Artists help make civic systems more understandable and accessible, and in doing so, they challenge the patterns of exclusion that shape who gets to participate and whose voices are heard and who holds power in this country. So, we're going to hear next are not abstract ideas. You're going to hear from incredible artists who are doing this work in real, tangible ways. They're working inside cities and communities and public systems to make civic life more understandable, accessible, participatory, and fun. So, with that, we're going to meet the people who do this work. I want to note that all of their work is also featured in our civic health issue of Forward, and we'll drop that in the chat so you can check that out later. I'm going to turn it back over to Mallory to facilitate this incredible panel.
So excited for you all to meet our panel. First is Pilar Finuccio, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy, also known as CUP. CUP does really exciting work, and I can't wait for you all to hear more about that. Pilar's work is at the intersection of design, policy, and community power. We'll hear more about what that looks like today. We're also excited that all of our speakers also have creative practices in addition to all the other hats that they wear. And we know that, Pilar, we are also a fan of your personal bookmaking practice. And we've heard that you're working on a stand-up routine about running a nonprofit. And so we hope at some point we get an invite to that. Thanks for being here, Pilar. We'll invite you to introduce yourself. I'm going to give Pilar a second to see if she joins us. And okay. Oh wait, here she is. Great. Hey,
Did I do it? I did it.
you did it.
I did it.
Here,
Amazing.
yes.
Sweet. And just a reminder, this is the time where I should introduce CUP as well as a full organization.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Who
fantastic.
CUP is.
Amazing. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. It's really exciting to be part of Forecast Conversation. My name is Pilar. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the executive director of CUP. We are an organization based in Brooklyn, New York. And just to illustrate a little bit of what we're going to get into today, I wanted to share some of what we've like our core programs. So before I share a few images in our PDF, we've been around since 2001. We're celebrating our 25th birthday this year, which just given everything that the Forecast team just shared, I feel like is an incredible testament to like the need and drive of artists and advocates that we work with to ensure the civic health and literacy of the New York City residents that we work with. Our mission has always been grounded in the power of art and design to become a way that we bridge these gaps that have been shared so far as the way that art can represent what people are experiencing, what they're building, the way that design can support literacy and access and kind of demystifying the complexity of these systems. And so we're feeling really glad that this is the work that we're part of today, especially talking with you all. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see a few things. I love the emphasis on concrete. So you can see some of the concrete ways that our work comes together. Can everyone see the screen okay? Or if Mallory, you can give me like a confirmation this is coming through all right?
I can see your screen.
Yeah, okay, gorgeous. I'm going to go ahead and full screen it. Beep. My computer's been throwing a temper tantrum. Let's see if it'll get me to. Okay, great. So just for context, like we're a team of a combination of artists, social workers, graphic designers, some folks who came from architecture, never got licensed, some folks who came from urban planning, but all the while we're deeply committed to, I included this picture because I think we're all deeply committed to the work of figuring out how to shape New York City together. This was our team at an exhibit about our work. And our work is designed into like two unique areas. The first is community education, and it is the work that we do with interdisciplinary teams of artists and designers who are committed to using their skills in service of uplifting education that drives movements and social change. And then advocates and organizers who see the role that art could play in building access, representation, and shared knowledge to support the advocacy and organizing that their teams are doing across many issues and many communities throughout the city. But this is a group of our last year's cohort whose projects are launching this year. And our work together to create educational resources is really driven by the three core areas of our practice is the interdisciplinary team, community collaboration through different sessions that build on both the priorities, the narrative, the actual drafts of the work, and keeping residents engaged in the progress and influence that their participation is having on the narrative, representation, and accuracy of the information we will ultimately distribute to usually somewhere in the realm of 3 to 6,000 people per resource. And while that's happening, we're also developing artists and designers to think about their identities and the way that that could impact the quality of the work that they create, and quality largely with an emphasis on the narratives, communities that we're representing, and the visions that are being put forth in these resources. So we're developing artists throughout our process as well. And our collaborations go on to create these public resources that are usually bilingual, if not trilingual, that break down these complex systems. So, for example, this year's work is breaking down a really particular housing policy, how newly arrived immigrants can consider different forms of a high school education or equivalencies, the work of community land trust organizers to gather local knowledge to galvanize protection of certain lands and housing. And then we also worked on a resource about a local law here enforcing the removal of lead in certain like lower income apartments. And so this is an example of like the breadth of issues that we've worked on and the different communities that we're working with every single year. And this work goes on to create shared learning experiences. Often these resources are launched and used in workshops and trainings to build shared context and a shared reality around what people are organizing or fighting for. They're also used to organize residents in the street, canvassing, going door to door, to engage residents in what might be a meeting or some form of deliberative democracy that the organizers might be doing to set policy agendas. They're also used to influence narrative and policies with both elected officials, but also the media and whoever is driving narrative around certain rights, in this case, the labor rights of nail salon workers. And then it's also used, our work is in the background to develop strategies with residents. So to actually use this work to think through a year's worth of strategies. In this case, this is about influencing the city budget. And then I'll also just share a little bit about our youth education work. Follows a similar ethos. We're invested in the work of supporting high school students to meaningfully engage in understanding the policies and systems that are impacting their neighborhoods. So we work in class and after school with high school students alongside teaching artists who support students through a project-based research and arts project that ultimately they will create together. They'll use arts to process what they're hearing from different local leaders throughout their research phases. And all of it culminates in all of the youth having created their own original art through different mediums. And we put together everything that they do into creative posters, publications, or videos that they then go on to share out with either their parents, loved ones, other students, or other community spaces within their neighborhoods. This is just a preview of that, and that's us. So eager to talk more, and I believe I'm passing it to Yazmany, right?
You're passing it to me, and I'll pass it to Yazmany.
Okay,
Thank
sweet.
you,
Absolutely. Excited
Pilar.
talking.
Thank you so much. I have been fangirling cups since I lived in New York over a decade ago. So
Oh,
I'm
hell
such
yeah.
a fan. Love the work that you all do.
That means so much. Thank you.
So now we're going to welcome Yazmany Arboleda. Thank you for being here. Yazmany is New York's inaugural People's Artist with the Civic Engagement Commission. It's an incredible role that signals what's possible when cities begin to see artists as essential civic partners. Yazmany's work is featured in Forward. Got great stories there all about the work that they've done. Colombian American artist, architect, civic designer, really playful, fun work. And Yazmany, I'll leave it to you to share more about it.
Thank you so much, Mallory, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yazmany Arboleda. Delighted to be with you all this afternoon, wherever you might be. And I am a visual storyteller. I will tell you that my pronouns are he, they. I am really interested in transformation and change as an artist. And so much of the work that I engage with has to do with how are we adapting? How are we adapting to the earth as it's changing? And how are we adapting as individual families, blogs, neighborhoods, cities, with each other, understanding that there's so much that's changing. I feel like one of the things that the pandemic taught us is that if everything can change in that radical way, then what else is possible? And I feel like from the very beginning of my own career as an artist, I've cared deeply about this question. What can we do together that we cannot do alone? I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. As a result of my work with city government, I have built something called the People's Creative Institute, which is really an organization that's focusing on how we can make democracy more like honey, sticky, sweet, embodied, delicious. I think of my drawings, my pencil drawings, as invitations to the future that we deserve for all living creatures on Earth. And oftentimes I think of them as operational documents. They show us what we need. So if it was a bus and we're going to turn it into a cafe, curtains, tables, chairs, the things that would hold the snacks as a mobile unit. And so, but I want to really begin and be really tactical and strategic in sharing. My beginning at the Civic Engagement Commission really begins by me being selected as the Public Artist in Residence. The Public Artist in Residence program in the city of New York is inspired by Merrill Lederman Ukeles, who in 1977 shook the hand of more than 800 sanitation workers and looked into their eyes and said, "Thank you for making our city possible." When Zoran Mamdani was running for mayor last year, I heard him tell the story, and something that I had never heard before until it came out of his mouth was that he had spoken to some of the sanitation workers, and they had shared that something had been healed within them that they didn't know was broken. When I think about the pandemic and people, banging their pants on the windows to honor and celebrate essential workers, I think, oh my goodness, how beautiful to think about artists going into government and systems to transform what we think is possible and necessary within those systems. And Merle is one of the folks who really leads by embodiment. And so when I showed up at the Civic Engagement Commission, my first day of work was August 3rd at 11 a.m. on a Zoom because everybody was still working from home during that time in 2020. And one of the things that I was shocked by was that the presentation that was shown to me that morning by Francis Urroz, who was one of the commission staff, was these pages that you're looking at in front of you. And I always share these because I think it's critical that you understand the shock that I felt when I saw that the way that the Civic Engagement Commission was telling their story felt like a document from the 1990s created in Word, where the people doing the storytelling were not thinking about fonts, colors, photography styles, all kinds of things. And I just thought immediately, oh my goodness, thank goodness I'm not here at the beginning of this agency. The Civic Engagement Commission was created by a citywide referendum where more than 1 million New Yorkers voted to create an agency dedicated to building trust in our democracy. And that was done in 2018. 2019 is the first year of the agency, and I come in 2020, right, in the middle of the pandemic. But critical to name the sequencing of that, because when I come in, I think of myself as an artist who can really be in place to support the origin story of this agency and how it manifests. So very early on, I learned that the Civic Engagement Commission, its charter is meant to focus on 3 lanes of work. Language access, we're meant to provide translators at poll sites. When people are voting, they should be able to vote in their language. We would run the citywide participatory budgeting program, and also we would create assistance for community boards. And as you're hearing me speak, I just want you to pay attention to the words that I'm using, because when I heard the words participatory budgeting, I was like, oh my goodness, the language we're using to tell the story of who we are sounds like eating cardboard. It is so uninteresting and flat and not compelling. And so one of the barriers to entry that I identified immediately in my first month of being at the job was that the language we use is not supportive of getting folks involved in the collaboration we need to succeed in our work. And then the other piece that I learned very early on was that there were 8 staff members of the Civic Engagement Commission, and that those 8 staff members identified as liberal, but in fact, they could not agree in the summer of 2020 to say the words Black Lives Matter in public as a group. And so I understood immediately that the work of my beginning was to name the values that the agency would espouse as its values, and that we would have to define those values together. And so here you look at my drawings of bees and beehives, because I immediately begin sketching. I'm a big um, uh, I think of myself as a follower of Adrienne Marie's Brown language. And so when I think about emergent strategy and looking at nature to learn from those systems to improve our own, I always think, gosh, how beautiful to look at I said it already, honey, sticky, sweet, delicious. How do we make democracy more like that? And so the work of identifying these values became critical. And then the work of creating a fleet or vehicles that would move towards people and meet them where they're at was essential. And so when I first showed up, I was like, oh my gosh, the millions of people on the streets who are protesting are our people. And technically the agency didn't think of those people are our people. But then I thought, how do we then create a narrative that, like, social injustice and the challenges of our society have to be addressed? And so we got a corrections bus from Rikers Island. We called that bus the People's Bus, and we invited New Yorkers to decide together what the bus should become by teaching them ranked choice voting. And so we created postcards that would invite folks to vote, ranked choice vote, if the bus should be a classroom, a gym, a wellness center, a stage. And more than 2,000 folks voted for it to become a place where performance happens. This is the bus once it was transformed. When the sun hits it, it becomes a rainbow. It's chromatic. And the interior of the bus is made of 8.8 million recycled glass beads. The idea is that the bus is a community center that serves the communities that are most harmed by our systems, our punitive justice system specifically. In 2022, we got a chance to lead Little Amal across New York City. We created 57 events where Little Amal met immigrants and people who have traveled across the world to find a home that is better suited for their families. It was really beautiful because we got Little Amal to participate in the People's Money, which is the name of our citywide participatory budgeting program. And much of the work of the People's Buzz has been to invite New Yorkers to relearn or to consider what is participatory budgeting, is residents deciding how we use public funds. Here again, we were able to hire immigrant mothers, paying them a dignified wage of $18 to $25 an hour to create more than 2,000 tentacles made of recycled fabrics to turn the bus into Tippy, the Tender People's Money Monster, where children and people of all ages learn about participatory budgeting by engaging with this large-scale puppet that goes across the city. I also really strongly believe that the environments that we do the work in inform the kind of work that is done. So we designed the interior of the Civic Engagement Commission in 2023 to be colorful and bright and beautiful. Again, we think that quality communicates dignity. And so the environment and the quality and the colors of that environment inform the work that these civil servants are doing. It's been really beautiful because, again, to animate and bring color and vibrancy to all of these spaces and to all of the activations of how we meet New Yorkers is really, again, it might sound simple, but the question of like color and font and the quality of the materials, it helps people understand that we've shown up and we're prepared to meet them and to really listen. And again, all of this is towards I think the biggest goal of this work is to really transform the assumption of what government looks like and feels like in our bodies, because we over prioritize the brain and the intellect. So often we leave behind what the elbow might be telling you about what we need to know about the future of New York or wherever we might be. But I think it's so essential to think of all the senses. And one of the things that I'll tell you is one of my favorite stories about the People's Bus actually is that I never thought that a young blind person would come up to that bus not knowing what it looked like and be able to hug the bus all the way around because they could feel the texture and sense the energy of how this was built. In 2024, we created the Sunnies, which are Sunshine Sentinels. There are more than 500 sculptures that are made of clay that represent New Yorkers from the future and the past. Here you see Shirley Chisholm running one of her rallies. She was the first Black person to ever run for president in the United States. And this is, again, one of my sketches showing the possibility of how these Sunnies would show up across New York City to invite New Yorkers to vote on how to use public funds, the people's money. And this is one of the ads that showed up in the subway system. I loved this story also, which is a little girl who was 9 years old named Sylvia on her way home to the shelter where she was staying with her family, saw these Sunnies on the subway and got home to the shelter and said to her mother, "Oh my goodness, Mom, I saw your work on the subway. I can't believe you're famous. We just got here less than a month ago," because they had come from the border with Texas on a bus and had been displaced in a way that was really challenging and hard. And to have her mother be involved in a project that was centered beauty and making our environments more beautiful was really, really meaningful to us. The Sonic family became larger because we invited artists to create an inflatable voting booth, which you see here. This was created by Mukentaka. It's an inflatable voting booth where people vote into the heart. And then these are civic and engagement, our large-scale Sunny puppets that go to parades. Their pronouns are they, them, because they were born at the Queen's Pride Parade back in June 2nd of 2024. I am speaking quickly because I know I'm running out of time and I want to make sure we get space to hear from our next panelist, but also to hear your questions and conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
I didn't want you to stop, but I appreciate I appreciate it. Anyone who doesn't understand that artists are visionary leaders, I mean, looking at your work, it's so very obvious, the honey that you bring. So thank you for bringing it. And I can't wait to dig more into that. We've got one more speaker who's going to introduce themselves, Reanne Estrada. Reanne is the co-principal and creative director of Public Matters in Los Angeles and was our one of our guest essayists for the last issue of Forward. So we are big fans of Reanne and all the work that Public Matters does. I'm going to invite Reanne to join and introduce themselves. Hello. You're on mute, Reanne. I want to hear your beautiful voice.
Hi, I'm just kidding. Hi, everybody. Reanne Estrada here from Public Matters. Thank you for sharing your screens and inviting me into it today. I am the co-principal and creative director of Public Matters, and I'm going to share some slides. All the stuff that I've seen from Yazmany and Pilar today have filled my heart with so much joy. Thank you both for making my Thursday morning. I'm very excited to have a conversation with you all. So I am going to attempt to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah, you see it.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So Public Matters is a creative studio for civic engagement. We are, it's an artistic practice that shapes as a social enterprise. Public Matters works for public benefit, so everybody thinks that we're a nonprofit, but we are actually a social enterprise. So for almost 20 years, we've embedded an artist sensibility into projects that address health and well-being. Healthy food access, tobacco control, parks and green space, traffic safety, and mobility justice. And throughout all of the work that we've done, the common thread is that we strive to build capacity for local self-determination so that people, particularly those historically excluded from decision-making, can shape places where they live, work, and play. So essentially, Public Matters works to expand the table, add more seats, and grow civic participation. And that's why we're all here today, because that's not an easy thing to do, right? Right now the conditions are not conducive. The conditions are not conducive to the vibrant practice of democracy. So Public Matters offers what the kids these days are calling a vibe shift, right? So I'll give you some examples of work that we've done in the past. So to address traffic safety in South Los Angeles, we perform crosswalk choreography with community members, delighting drivers into slowing down to save lives. We arrange for a pollution monster piñata smash at a corner store parking lot in City Terrace so residents can symbolically and cathartically whack the heck out of toxic pollutants that poison their air. More recently, we've started to recruit members for a Boo-Boo Bandage Brigade to mark infrastructure ouchies in downtown LA and to organize around long-term solutions. So what we strive to do is to make civic participation less soul-suck and more conspiratorial joy. I'm seeing themes in the speakers today that really fill my heart, because this is really important that we make the process of civic participation something that fills people. We also tend to use humor, as you've seen, to kind of to bring people in. And there are 4 things that we tend to do with our work, and I'll just go through them right now. One is we attempt to find a way in, because before we can demystify civic systems, you have to get people's attention. You have to, like, I really appreciate Yazmany's examples where you're really bringing the full body into it, making it sensorial, and it really respects the way that you respect the whole person, right? Going outside, just thinking about the intellect and more about the embodied experience. We also create opportunities for people to take space in public. And there's a reason that Public Matters does collaborative group activations out in public. We find that bringing bodies together so they take up physical space in the public realm helps to shift from a siloed, private individual mindset to a more connected, collective civic mindset. And so, with that, we make sure that we're able to also build knowledge and capacity. A lot of our projects include doing what CUP does as well, basically translating bureaucraties into people speak. We lead educational workshops, and we also develop local leadership programs. And ultimately, the goal is to cultivate a shared ownership of the public realm through direct action. And this is something that's not a one and done. It's something that we hope will become a practice. And I'll share an example of a project that we did recently. It's how the Los Angeles County Regional Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors went to the dogs, or the step-by-step East Los Angeles pedestrian plan, which is what we are working on. Public Matters worked with the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health to collect public input on the East Los Angeles pedestrian plan. Our task was to make sure that we could get community contributions about their experiences of the street, and also to identify their priorities. And the plan, its intent is to guide the implementation of vital infrastructure. From a traffic safety perspective, the area has some of the most dangerous streets in the county. Cars are crashing, people are dying. Safe and accessible streets are important. And yet somehow people are not really lining up to contribute to something like a pedestrian plan. And really, how many people actually really know what a pedestrian plan is, right? So what's our way in here? What does Public Matters do? Clearly, from this photo, adorable, furry animals. I know it's shameless, but you do what you got to do. So what we realized is that in the community of East Los Angeles, people love their dogs. People of all ages, abilities, any time of day, they're walking their animals around the street. So they have a front row seat into what is the pedestrian perspective. So what's the most natural thing to do? Why, of course, let's plan a pet parade. So we planned this pet parade in conjunction with the Queer Mercado. And this was a way to reach a broad range of people who would never even think about contributing to a pedestrian plan. But a bunch of folks showed up, got their animals, dressed them up in costumes. We had a competition for, I think, best active transportation and also best Selena. Because of the association with the Queer Mercado's theme for the week. And So while people were participating in the parade, getting lined up, getting their photos taken, we engaged folks in conversations about their experiences on the street. And so from there, it was a really easy, easy step to go from there to talking with them about the pedestrian plan and getting their input there and getting them to buy in. We also made sure that people had the opportunity to show their support for the plan by signing a petition to politicians. We love the Public Matters loves the puns here, and we gave the opportunity for humans and animals, or rather animals and their humans, to sign the petition in support of safer streets for all ages, abilities, and animals. And throughout the East LA pedestrian plan was about 2.5 years worth of work, during which time we had educational workshops. We had educational workshops where we tried to reach groups that would not be likely to come to an official public meeting. So we reached elders, people with disabilities, even kids, and got their input into the pedestrian plan. So once we got this broad show of support, we brought the petition, this guy, we brought it to the LA County Board of Supervisors meeting where the plan was being put to a vote. And here, as you can see, it's quite long. We unrolled it as part of official public comment. So there's a little bit of performance art there. And during the time we were unrolling it, at one point, one of the LA County Board of Supervisors jumps up from her chair, runs over, takes a selfie with the petition, runs back, and then votes with the rest of the board to approve the plan. And so one of the things, one of the things that came out of the plan is not just a record that highlights community voices and really centers the lived experience of the people in the community who use the streets, but it's also there's also a way in which we were building leadership on the ground, because in addition to the workshops, we had we developed local leaders through a community advisory committee. So these are folks who are rooted in the community, who didn't really know, they're not experts in transportation planning, but through the process of working with us on the pedestrian plan, they became local experts. And so that's something that I want to make sure that we're highlighting when we're talking about expanding civic participation. Yes, we want to make sure that we're getting a broad swath of people participating, and we need to make sure that we're creating pathways for leadership to folks, for folks within communities that are underrepresented, to make sure that they can participate and be heard as well. Okay. Here's my contact info. Please get in touch.
I have had the joy of seeing Reanne's work in person. It was one of the Slow Streets events. I don't think I met up with you, Reanne, but I have a photo of me holding like one of the turtles with people.
Yeah,
I don't know if we ever
slow jams. Yes.
Yeah, slow jams is really fun.
Yeah.
Just super playful work and really vibrant. I think all of our speakers, their work is of that spirit. So let's dig in a little bit into conversation. I want to actually go to the chat first, and then we'll kind of tuck that chat into our conversation. So I'm going to ask all of our attendees here this question that I'm throwing in the chat, which is, what civic system or issue would you like to understand better? What's one that you really would need to figure out how to hack better, that's important to your life? So they all kind of presented different examples, but curious what comes up for you if you drop it in the chat. And we'll let folks think about the answer to that question or roll on into the chat with any answers. while I start asking our panel a similar question, which is, what civic system or issue does your work make more understandable for the public? And I know you had a lot of examples, so maybe you can talk, about one or two. And we'll just popcorn around so you can come off mute.
I'm happy to start, guys. Only because it's like so top of mind right now. If you follow New York City local politics, a bunch of our land use laws just changed around affordable housing. And so cut for, I would say maybe like close to 15 years has been tending to this like series of toolkits around land use in New York City. They like follow a progression. It starts with like explaining zoning and then getting into how zoning changes and like how developments can affect neighborhoods through our process. The acronym's ULURP. And then it goes into like the negotiations for affordable housing that typically happen during a ULURP rezoning or development proposal. So then the final toolkit is explaining different affordable housing programs throughout New York City, how people qualify, and how local residents can organize with their city council members to advocate for that housing being built amidst proposals to the Department of City Planning. And now we're adding a resource that explains when either zoning, ULURP, or the laws around affordable housing are changing either through election and voting like they did in the fall, or they're just changing because of like mayoral priorities. So I think that's been a huge part of our work, because I think in anything that we look at, and I'm so glad that Reanne had examples of like pedestrian safety and that Yazmany had examples of like public spaces, because when we think about how we get access to those things and who it's for, so much of that is affected by the real estate industry and who's building what and where and what priorities city council members are going to advocate for. Oftentimes, public space is a negotiation amidst that because we're looking for additional benefits. If we're going to hand over this amount of real estate or this amount of tax subsidies, residents want to know what they're going to get out of it, when not only are they not living in that building, they might not be able to afford that building, but are going to be affected by the spillover of increased transportation needs, increased education needs, burdens on other amenities. And so that I think has been like the one of the core offerings of our work for a long time, because it just touches everything in New York City, whether we think about it or not. And so I'll end there. But land use is huge in New York, and has been one of our critical education goals.
And I will chime in and share a little bit about my journey with participatory budgeting, which I'll tell you, one of the funniest stories is that we've done commercials for participatory budgeting through a bunch of our programs. And every time we tried folks to even say the words participatory budgeting, it's hard to say, okay? Nobody says it correctly. Even the word Civic Engagement Commission can be translated into English in 3 different ways. So language is always the thing that I'm dealing with. But I will tell you that in my journey of participatory budgeting and the people's money, as we call it in New York City, one of the things that has happened, we've evolved the program every year. It's grown. We've invested more and more money into the arts and how many artists we bring into the work of it. But I will share with you that even this year, we asked PS1 to be a partner, a cultural hub where people can vote, one of our museums in Queens. And they said, oh, no, we already got it because we're already working on participatory budgeting with our district, with our council member. And there lies one of the realities that I struggle with all the time, which is we have 2 types of programs in New York City. The program that's run by the council members, which is around $1.2 to $1.5 million per district, is capital money. And the difference between their capital money and our capacity to fund projects and programs is enormously different, and getting folks to understand that those programs are different, or designing together with the council members how we undo the notion that these things are confusing people because folks assume they're the same thing. Even there, like there's enormous negotiation. I know there's frustration across council members and other folks across the city who say, oh my gosh, you guys are doing your program and it's confusing us and it's confusing people. But the truth is, like, shouldn't we be working together to make sure that folks understand that all these resources and all this money is available to everyone in different ways? And the education and the process that we go on is, gosh, how do we make it compelling and beautiful and interesting to tell the story of what's been? So now we're working on exhibitions that show the projects that have been funded over the past 4 years, that show that we have middle schoolers in Brooklyn who created a care hotline to address suicide prevention, and it was an idea from like eighth graders in District 15 in Brooklyn. And so there's so many expressions of what it means for folks to have power to say, hey, this is how we use our money, and this is what would benefit us. And one of the things that's really special about our program is that anyone, regardless of immigration status, can participate, starting at the age of 11. And again, this is a question of like how young is too young to vote and to engage. And we feel strongly that the earlier folks begin to participate and understand these things, the more they'll be likely to engage in their lifetime as they get older.
I mean, that's so amazing. Like when I just think about that, like that expansion of power and including as many people as possible is so it's just really so moving. Like I'm literally like speechless right now. Um, so a lot of public matters work recently has been in the traffic safety and transportation space. A big part of the work that we've done with the community advisory committees and also with the communities at large is that we try to make sure that that the information is digestible for them, and we always want to make sure that we're making clear the relevance to their lives and that we're centering their lived experiences in all the work that we're doing. And often, a big one of the things that sticks with me is how a number of people that we've reached out to participate and to contribute to things like the pedestrian plan, is that people are just really happy to be asked, right? Um, I People are not asked enough or not asked in a way that they feel like they're being asked. And so I think that is that's something that is really core to what we do, like and
Rianne,
making people seen. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to chime
No,
in and say
please.
that one of the things that I think is really critical is doing that ask, that beginning of the what does the ask feel like is important, I think, to think
Right.
about. But then I think another aspect of the process that I think is essential and that I think oftentimes people don't really think about is once people have given you feedback, what are you
Right.
doing with that feedback? And how do you get back to them to say, hey, what you shared with us mattered and informed X, Y, and Z? Because I feel
Right.
like that to me is accountability. And so often it's a little bit like, oh, that's yes, we are going to ask information, but where's the exchange?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the exchange is absolutely important. It can't be extractive, right? Because it can't just be like, here you go. We'll take what you have, and then we're done, right? And when we're talking about projects that have a longer timeline, like infrastructure builds, I mean, it's really important to make sure that we factor in that like feedback loops and that it's not just a one and done. So when we worked on the pedestrian plan, we gathered input, and then the county made a draft plan, and then we went back to people to make sure, did we get it right? How does this represent your values and your priorities? And so from there, you make sure that there is a plan for revision. And then, it's a little bit more complicated. You want to make sure that there's also a plan for accountability, because, plans are wonderful. They can be guideposts, and we want to make sure that we're holding our elected officials and our public agencies to account, but it does get more complex. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier, that sort of evolved from the pedestrian plan work, is that we are now engaged. We're wrapping up a project that is a participatory planning project in East LA with specific mobility corridors. And that project brings people together, the broader public and also the Community Advisory Committee, working directly with the LA County Department of Public Works. So it's no longer just, okay, it's siloed, it's a community. This is what the community thinks, and this is what the public agency does. It's bringing them together as people and making sure that we're making those connections and ideally seeding those relationships so that when the funding is done for a particular project, there's a way, there's a way for people to go back to the people that they met, they got to know as humans, and move forward. Right.
May I ask you a question, Mallory, and to all of us? I'll tell you that one of the things that's been really challenging inside of the work at the Civic Engagement Commission is to recognize the values and practices of the agency in its adjacency of being a part of a government system. And so the question that I think about when I think about what we're talking about is often we associate civics to like in some ways to government and government support and collective health. And maybe, yeah, that's what I would say. And it's been hard because inside of government, I will tell you that since Donald Trump was elected again, we've been asking the question, how do we protect people from ourselves? And so when I think about the question of follow through and like being accountable, it's so interesting to think about, my goodness, we actually have to be careful with what kind of information we gather from the communities we're collaborating and we're meant to be supporting, because the construct is that the federal government has values and practices that are not in alignment with our local values and practices of the agency we're running here. And so I just bring that up because in my mind, the question of how vulnerable can governments be, I think to build trust, you have to admit that you're in process and that that you need support. And sometimes that tension is real, which is government is meant to be look like it has it together, it knows what it's doing, it has its systems, but everything's changing and continues to change. So how do we admit that we need collaboration and support from external parties and people while maintaining a level of assuredness or like a confidence that it's going to be okay, even when we don't know that that's true?
I think you're hitting on like a really key point, which is that institutions are, they're really connected to this idea of stability, right? They need to feel like they endure. And so, and some of the side effects of that framework is that the agencies and the government can feel very cumbersome and very slow to change and not quick enough to respond, right? So that's something that I feel like we need to contend with. Maybe like what does institutional vulnerability look like? Can we change the conversation so that that becomes a strength and not a weakness?
Yeah, I'm just this is like a raw-ish idea, only because I was actually Yazmany we were supposed to be there, or we tried to get you there, the deliberative democracy thing that was hosted yesterday in New York, but something that came up a lot as we were exploring like the constraints and benefits and of something like deliberative democracy spaces where like residents are actually being given like policy recommendation authority, is like I often think about it, and or I was bringing up like even like in friendships, if I just think of like my own relationships, is like when either person in that friendship is dealing with a challenge and like how they've met that challenge before and like what they've asked of you in supporting that challenge is like, if that starts to happen too many times, like you're always vulnerable about just how much you're struggling. And it's difficult as a friend then to see like, okay, how have you responded to those struggles? It's like all that's part of our relational knowledge of each other. And I think that's not so different from institutions. It's like we often ask residents to engage in these processes that are about institutions becoming better, but it can take 5-10 years to see the benefits of that vulnerable moment of saying, I'll come help you be better, because it should ultimately benefit me, whether that's a friendship or an institution, whatever it is that we're relying on. And I feel like if an institution hasn't shown how it recovers from its own challenges in a way that shows they have it enough together that when I ask for help, I'm not burdening you with my getting it together, because I think that's what residents are already experiencing most of the time. It's you're not meeting my needs. I don't even know what you're doing back there. And I've been waiting for the thing you did say you were going to do. So it just brings up this curiosity about like before you can admit your own vulnerabilities, how much showing up in the right way do you need to do before you say, can you give me 20% of grace? in hopes that that 20% will open us up to whatever 40% amount of greater collaboration, understanding in service of pushing our shared needs forward, with the institution as resources and authority pushing forward, and residents as like collaborators in the vision that those resources and authority like actually like goes on to assert. But I think there's a balance there when residents haven't seen their own vulnerability met. And I think institutions are also notorious for like whether it's income-based eligibility, or do you have the 20,000 pieces of paper that I asked you for? Like, how did institutions show up for them in their most vulnerable moments when they actually needed something? So it's like, now you want my grace when you need something. You're like, well, you've never shown me anything and I lost a house, like, so there is this like, how have we shown people we will be right with ourselves so that we can be right with them? And I don't feel like that's any exception for institutions. It probably feels a little differently than your friends, but I don't think it's any exception.
I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could call our government institutions our friends?
Or at least it felt friendlier.
Or friendly, right? I mean,
Friendly enough. Yeah.
I mean, when I think about the work that I've been able to accomplish inside of government, it's really critical that we name that government is not monolithic. It's made up of people, and it's about finding the allies inside of those spaces that are going to show up and be advocates for the way you're thinking and approaching the questions. Because I'll give you another example. At some point in the last 5 years, there's a lot of cuts, budget cuts all the time. And even this year, we're dealing with some new budget cuts. And at some point they said, oh, there's no money for arts and culture for this year. We have to cut that line in the budget. And I said, oh, wait, what? And because I understood that budget, I said, we have a budget that says that there's money for marketing and there's money for communications. Can we pull from that to create the artistry and the culture that we're already building? And it's in my mind, it's understanding what it's being called or named, so you can come in and be like, actually, there's other opportunities, and here's what that looks like. We can transform that money into A, B, C, D, E. And just like paying immigrant mothers to create little sculptures that are beautiful in and of themselves, I think of those as art pieces, but I think about the bigger art piece being able to actually take money from the government to actually give dignity to the head of household immigrant mothers who need that support right now. And then how do you then invite people to be like, that's the story we want to be telling? Isn't that the richest expression of who we are and what we can do when we think about our needs and our resources? So
I love this, where we've gone with this first question, or I guess this first two, three, however many questions came up. Because I think what you all are sharing is that your creative practices live both inside of the institutional work that you're doing. And I know one of my colleagues, Amanda Lovely, always says that her medium is government. So your medium is also these civic systems and being creative at actually navigating them. And that system itself is material. And then also we've seen so much of in your examples, your robust practice actually. Then what do you do with some of those civic challenges? How do you bring community in? How do you actually change how systems are running? So I want to pivot a little bit more over to that second half and learn a little bit more about what really makes your work tick. I know there's going to be an institutional component, but also want to hear a little bit more about what creative approaches have been most effective in helping communities engage with those very systems that you're talking about. I know that you all mentioned things like deliberative democracy. Pilar, you mentioned deliberative democracy. Yazmany, you talked about making an inner engagement like honey, making it multisensorial. And then Reanne, you talked about conspiratorial play, which I love. So how do you kind of bring those approaches in to the community component of the civic practice?
I mean, I can start by just sharing that a huge part of the way that I approach the work is to be iterative and experimental. And so in my art practice, I always think that it's really important to name risk, that we are risk forward, that we are experimenting. And I think naming the risk, I'll give you an example. When we were creating the People's Buzz, I was fundraising for the project as we were building it inside of a 1-year contract. And one of the things that I learned at that time was that, my goodness, you cannot fundraise for something as you're building the project because you don't know how much you have to work with, which means you don't know how much the contracts will be for how the people are going to do the work. And so everyone was excited about the idea of transforming a corrections bus into a community center, and everyone showed up as a volunteer. But because we fundraised the money to be able to pay folks, it became really messy and challenging over time to agree on how much should you get paid for what we were doing when you showed up to do it for free originally. All to say is, I think often we talk about the notion of you build the plane as you're flying it. And I just think I always say now that it's entirely irresponsible and dangerous. You cannot fly a plane that is not constructed already, and you need parameters to understand how do you begin and how many folks can you bring into the fold. But financial pieces are one aspect of the resources that I think about. I often think about space, humans, all kinds of other elements that can be a kind of currency that supports the growth of an idea. But to me, it is essential to be iterative and experimental and to name that upfront, to be like, what does that mean of how we're going to engage and what's going to be tested and where the blurry or complicated areas that we might not know now, but that we're going to explore and learn from together as we move through this journey.
Yeah, I can share next on the I think we're in a similar space around like iteration and I think the other thing that feels really central to our work is we do like a lot of like baselining together, like I think collaboration depending on, well, one, we're like a new group of humans every time we start a project. And so like our team knows, we know each other. And advocates and organizers generally have a sense, of what our work is doing, either because they've heard from friends who've also worked with us. The artists and designers are always new to us. So there's a level of like baselining together on like, what are we saying we all value and that's why we're here? Do we need to talk through any of that stuff? What are we saying is like everyone's role and does that feel right? Like where might those roles get like a little bit fluid because like we all have ideas, but like who's ultimately executing on said idea and like which portion of it? But as far as like the community sessions, I think that's also where people are meeting for the first time or they're meeting for the first time in this context, right? Where we're going to make choices about the values that are going to ultimately inform how we write and like present an educational resource, like the narratives that we need to like combat or uplift that often get like lost in the mix. And so I do think like community sessions, often just talking with people in a space that is easy for them to get to, where they feel comfortable thinking and feeling, because like we're kind of on their terms, like we'll go anywhere really. And is like it's just a good conversation. And then we often bring like iterations or like prototypes depending on like where our work is at to like start the conversation and start by saying like these are choices we've already made. Let's poke some holes in them, where things can be mixed around versus these are choices we haven't made that should be made with everybody in this room. And that's, what we're ultimately here for. And then, what Reanne and Yazmany were getting at is like in between those sessions, how are we updating people on like, great, so this is what came out of it. So the next time we all see you, we're going to be moving from like this next bucket of decisions and influence. But it's largely through community conversations. We don't often mostly stray from that just because we have like an hour and a half to 2 hours. We might like try some other ways of like learning about what we're doing by going to like webinars or documentaries, or like other community events that are already happening where we can like learn just in different ways what the narrative is. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I would definitely echo the iterative process of this work and the risk taking, which is, I will add, risk taking is something that is diametrically opposed to that institutional security piece that we talked about. So here we're recognizing some of the tensions or the frictions that can happen when you try to collaborate. I also think that in terms of working with community folks, it's super important to meet people where they are. So many of the public agency and government processes expect people to go to them. And that's not always feasible. You have your meetings in the middle of the day when people are at work. So how do you expect them to be able to give public comment and to participate fully? And so I think, for us, we've in the different projects we've done, we've made sure that we're always going out to where the people are, and that we're embedding whatever work we're doing in the culture of the place where we're working, so that it doesn't feel like it's dropped in from the outside. We never want it to feel that way. It needs to feel like something that is co-created with the community members that we're working with. You know, I gave the example of the slow jams. You know, that has a super low barrier to participation. You recruit anybody who's willing, you have a bunch of colorful props, and basically you are walking across the street, dancing, shimmying, whatever, just making your way across the street while the light lets you do so. And within that space, people are free to to kind of riff. At one point, we had cheerleaders come in. They did a routine, then left. And I think there's there's something magical that happens when you create something with somebody else. And it seems like this is something that Yazmany and Pilar, you both do in your practice. You're co-creating all the work with people in communities where you're working. Okay.
I'm going to do two rapid fire questions, one from our back end and then one from the audience. So we'll do kind of rapid fire. This question is, what changes when people move from a feeling of confusion or exclusion around civic systems? So what changes when you move from that towards understanding and participation? What is different in your communities? What is tangibly different? And maybe Yazmany, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know. I love your reference, Pilar, to like thinking about friendships and relationships in that way. And in my mind, it's relational. So when you bring people into the fold of information that felt scary or foreign to them, we're bringing them into a kind of belonging to be like, no, no, we speak the same language. No, no, we're part of the same thing. Like there's a kind of relational love that is manifested that I always, when I think about how I define democracy right now, it's the act of taking care of each other. And in my mind, it is about the manifestation in physical space of being like, no, 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 we got each other. It makes me think about dolphins and whales in the middle of the ocean who work together with birds to literally find food for each other, and they're working in a relational, familial way, even though they're interspecies. And to me, again, another opportunity to learn from the natural world, to be like, no, we need each other. It helps us understand who we are in the context of who we're with and where we are. All of that to me is about really kind of centering belonging and the fact that we are here together in process.
You can go next. Yeah, I think there are some changes that happen like in the room of making together that like Reanne like talked about. I think it builds like a level of cohesion around people who like if you showed up, you already have shared values, you might not know each other. And I think there's just those small sparks of being like, oh, these are my neighbors. Okay, cool. You care. You're starting to like check everybody in the room. And I think that builds just a reminder, which can be very difficult in between weeks of struggle, that like, okay, cool. I'm not the only person who cares about this. There is an energy. There are people who want to have this conversation and make sure I'm part of it. And that's, I think, is in its like smallest way. And then it's like in its greatest way. Like sometimes we consider a project successful when people are like point out like what we didn't include because they're already thinking about like what's that next level of education or conversation that they want to be having that like felt like it was missing. Our projects have a certain amount of scope, so there's always something missing, but it just shows that like there's still that hunger for like we often call it internally like 101, 201, 301. We like think in college class references. And so we're like, oh, okay, cool. That's like the 301 version, as we start to think about how we need to scaffold out that shared baseline. So I think you just start to see that the curiosity not only like transcends what you thought people wanted or could stomach, but it also just shows you like, okay, cool. Like if we built this whole thing out, people would absolutely come to class, just to keep that metaphor going. And they'd be really excited to participate in what that class was all about. So I think there's like that increased curiosity, which feels like it ties really nicely into one of the data points that was shared before of like the more you know, the more curious you get, and that curiosity turns into action. And then I think the last part also for like the advocates and organizers is like it always deepens their practice, their understanding of community. It always deepens like the narrative and their confidence in what they're putting out into the world. And as people who are like not only stewarding those movements, but are also deeply caring of like who's involved and who's not, I think it just builds another level of like cohesion around, even if you think a CBO or a nonprofit is like one institution up from you, they're all part of this scaffold of institutional trust. And so I think it also just like binds people to the institution or organization that brought them in the first place. Reanne, you're on mute.
Sorry. So I think one of the things that can come out of this kind of this recognition or a sense of empowerment is also potentially being able to to see that even though you don't ideologically align with people that are brought together, because that's something that Public Matters likes to do. We like to make sure that we're bringing people who have different experiences, different perspectives together to problem solve. Is that you can recognize that, oh, we totally don't agree about a bunch of other things, but on this thing we can definitely agree on. And an example for that would be the the Boo Boo Bandage Brigade that we've launched recently. So that has lots of strange bedfellows, but all people who connect because of their experience of the streets and sidewalks. So we brought together folks who are disabilities rights advocates, local residents, business improvement districts, artist groups that are, houseless advocates, like, so a mix of people who otherwise in other settings would be like, "Arr," like, they're like, yeah, but, I don't want to trip and fall and hurt myself, on the street. And this is important to us so that they can come together. And I think there's a way in which you're able to, if you can just open that door just a little bit, there's just a little bit more possibility that we can make some kind of a change, right? Because it's not, um, we're no longer as siloed as we may have been before that. So I'm hoping that, um, what people take from it is more of an opening up generally.
Opening up. Thank you all. Um, we have some great questions in the chat that I don't think we're gonna have time to get to, but just so you all know, folks are curious about how funders can support this work, the difference between artist-driven initiatives and community-driven initiatives. So there's just a lot more to discuss, and hopefully you all will come back for the rest of our series because I'm sure we'll dig into more of that throughout. And I'm going to bring Teresa back on to take us out and just thank our panelists so much for this rich conversation. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all so much. If we can get some applause and some love for all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. We could go on and on with this conversation. And I do want to just address that question that came up about funding. We have our final session in this series will be about funding. We really wanted to dig in those questions. How can we support artists doing this incredible work? How can we create those infrastructures for resources for this? So thank you to all of you, and thank you for being here for this conversation, everybody who has stayed with us and engaged. We have 4 more sessions ahead in this series. I hope you will continue with us. Our next session is Deep Roots of Belonging, Lessons from Rural and Southern Cultural Leadership. And our guest will be Carrie Fountain from Foot Soldiers Park in Selma, Alabama, Sassa Wilkes from Recreate Appalachia in Huntington, West Virginia. Jen, if you can put the next slide on for me. Also, Ash Hansen with Department of Public Transformation, Granite Falls, Minnesota. Erin Michelle Washington with Soul Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and Holly Dahl with Ignite Rural in Bismarck, North Dakota. So I hope if you felt like we didn't get into the kind of rural conversation and Southern conversation, that's our entire packed panel group next time, and that will be on May 28th. And I also want to share that we have started building an arts and civic health toolkit. And so in the email follow-up that you're going to receive from us in the next week, there's an opportunity to email us at creativepower@forecastpublicart.org and submit your work, your tools, your resources into this toolkit so we can have a national resource for folks doing this kind of work. And so over the next 6 months, we will continue to have this conversation. We invite you to stay engaged. And I hope you're leaving today with a sense of hope from all of these incredible stories and work that's going on around the country. Feel free to connect with us or anyone on the panel. I know folks shared their contact information and you can find them. We can include that in our follow-up. But thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.